Chapter 1, the 100th birthday party. I jumped out of bed that morning with one question in my mind: sun or fog? Usually it was fog in January in Holland. I leaned as far as I could from the single window in my bedroom in our building called the Bayet. It was always hard to see the sky from there. Brick walls looked back at me in this crowded center of Haarlem, but I could see a patch of pale blue sky. Father's bedroom was directly under mine, but at 77 he slept soundly. "You're not growing younger yourself," I reminded my reflection in the mirror. I was 45 years old and unmarried. My sister Betsy, 7 years older than I and also unmarried, still had that slender grace that made people turn and look after her in the street. Heaven knows it was not her clothes. Our little watch shop had never made much money. Below me, down on the street, the doorbell rang. I opened my door and plunged down the steep, twisting stairway. Actually, the Bayet was 2 houses. The one in the front was a typical old Haarlem structure, 3 stories high, 2 rooms deep, and only 1 room wide. At some point, its rear wall had been knocked through to join with the even thinner, steeper house in back of it, which had only 3 rooms, one on top of the other, and this narrow corkscrew staircase squeezed between the 2. Betsy was at the door ahead of me. An enormous spray of flowers filled the doorway. We searched the bouquet for the card. "Pickwick," we shouted together. Pickwick was a wealthy customer who not only bought the very finest watches, but often came upstairs to the family part of the house above the shop. His real name was Herman Slurring. Pickwick was the name Betsy and I used between ourselves because he looked like the illustrator's drawing in our copy of Dickens. Herman Slurring was short, bald, and immensely fat, and his eyes were such that you were never quite sure whether he was looking at you or someone else. He was as kind as he was fearsome to look at. The flowers had come to the side door the family used, opening onto a tiny alleyway, and Betsy and I carried them into the shop. First was the workroom, where watches and clocks were repaired. Then there was the high bench over which Father had bent for so many years, doing the delicate, painstaking work that was known as the finest in Holland. In the center of the room was my bench. Next to mine, Hans's the apprentice, and against the wall, old Christoffel's. Beyond the workroom was the customer's part of the shop, with its glass case full of watches. All the wall clocks were striking 7 as Betsy and I carried the flowers in. Ever since childhood, I had loved to step into this room, where 100 ticking voices welcomed me. I unlocked the street door and stepped into the Bardejordsstraat. The other shops up and down the narrow street were still shuttered. The opticians next door, the dress shop, the baker's, Wheels Furriers across the street. I folded back our shutters and admired the window display. It held a collection of clocks and pocket watches, all at least 100 years old, all borrowed for the occasion, for today was the shop's 100th birthday. In January 1837, Father's father had placed in this window a sign: Ten Boom, Watches. The doorbell on the alley rang again. More flowers. So it went for an hour. Large bouquets and small ones, elaborate pieces and homegrown plants in clay pots. For although the party was for the shop, the affection was for Father. Haarlem's grand old man, they called him. When the shop and the workroom would not hold another bouquet, Betsy and I carried them upstairs to the 2 rooms above the shop. Though it was 20 years since her death, these were still Tante John's rooms. Tante John's was Mother's older sister, and her presence lingered in the massive dark furniture she had left behind. At 7:45, Hans the apprentice arrived, and at 8, Toos, our sales-lady bookkeeper. Toos was a sour-faced individual whose unpleasant personality had made it impossible for her to keep a job until, 10 years ago, she had come to work for Father. Father's gentle courtesy had mellowed her, and though she would never have admitted it, she loved him as fiercely as she disliked the rest of the world. We left Hans and Toos to answer the doorbell and went upstairs to get breakfast. I set out 3 plates. The dining room was in the house at the rear, 5 steps higher than the shop but lower than Tante John's rooms. This room, with its single window looking into the alley, was the heart of the home. We used only a corner of the table now, Father, Betsy, and I, but to me the rest of the family was still there. There was Mama's chair and the 3 aunts' chairs. Not only Tante John's, but Mama's other 2 sisters had also lived with us. Next to me had sat my other sister, Noli, and Willem, the only boy. Noli and Willem had homes of their own now, and Mama and the aunts were dead. but I still seemed to see them here. Their chairs had not stayed empty long. Father could never bear a house without children, and whenever he heard of a child in need of a home, a new face appeared at the table. Out of his watch shop that never made much money, he fed and cared for 11 more children after his own 4 were grown. Now these 2 had grown up and married or gone off to work, and so I laid 3 plates on the table. Betsy brought the coffee in from the tiny kitchen off the dining room, and we heard Father's step coming down the staircase. He went slowly now on the stairs, but still as punctual as one of his own watches. He entered the dining room, as he had every morning since I could remember, at 8:10. Father's hair and beard were now as white as the tablecloth, but his blue eyes behind the thick brown spectacles were as mild and merry as ever. He gazed from one of us to the other. "Corrie, dear, my dear Betsy, how lovely you both look." He bowed his head and said the blessing. How could we have guessed as we sat there, 2 middle-aged sisters and an old man, that we were about to be given adventures such as we had never dreamed of? Adventure and anguish, horror and heaven were just around the corner. In that room on that day, we did not know. Father took the big Bible from its shelf as Tooz and Hans came in. Scripture reading at 8:30 each morning for all who were in the house was another of the points around which life in the Bay revolved. Father turned to the Gospel of Luke, where we had left off yesterday. He looked up. "Where's Christoffels?" Christoffel was the 3rd and only other employee in the shop, a little man who looked older than Father, though actually he was 10 years younger. I remember the day, years earlier, when he first came into the shop, so ragged that I had assumed he was a street beggar. I was about to send him up to the kitchen, where Betsy kept a pot of soup simmering, when he announced with great dignity that he was considering permanent employment and was offering his services first to us. We learned Christoffels belonged to an almost vanished trade, the clockmaker who trudged on foot through the land, regulating and repairing the tall pendulum clocks that were the pride of every Dutch farmhouse. Father hired him on the spot. "They're the finest clockmen anywhere," he told me later, "these wandering clocksmiths. There's not a repair job they haven't handled with just the tools in their sack." People all over Haarlem brought their clocks to Christoffels. What he did with his wages, we never knew. He had remained as threadbare as ever, though Christoffels' most notable quality was his pride. Now, for the first time ever, Christoffels was late. Father polished his glasses with his napkin and started to read, his deep voice lingering over the words. Eventually, we heard Christoffels' shuffling steps on the stairs. The door opened, and all of us gasped. Christoffels was resplendent in a new black suit, checkered vest, white shirt, tie, and stiff starched collar. "Christoffels, my dear associate," Father murmured in his formal way, "what a joy to see you." And he resumed his Bible reading. Soon the doorbells were ringing, both the shop bell on the street and the bell in the alley. Tooz and I hurried to the doors. Before long, a steady stream of guests climbed the narrow staircase to Tante John's rooms, where Father sat almost lost in a thicket of flowers. As I helped one of the older guests up the steep stairs, Betsy seized my arm. "We need Noli's cups right away." "I'll go get them." Our sister, Noli, and her husband were coming as soon as their 6 children got home from school. I dashed down the stairs, took my coat and my bicycle from inside the alley door, and set out over the bumpy brick streets. Noli and her husband lived about 1.5 miles from the Bay, outside the center of the city. I pedaled there often. How could I foresee as I zipped around corners that one day I would stand on Noli's street with my heart thudding in my throat, daring to go no closer to her house for fear of what was taking place there? Today I careened onto the sidewalk and burst through the door with never a knock. "Noli, we need cups, right now!" Noli came out of the kitchen, her pretty face flushed with baking. "They're all packed by the door. I wish I could go with you, but I've got more still to bake." "You're all coming, aren't you?" "Yes, Corrie, Peter will be there." I loved all my nieces and nephews, but Peter, well, was Peter. At 13, he was a musical prodigy and a rascal and the pride of my life. The Bay was even more crowded when I got back. The mayor of Haarlem was there, and the postman and the trolley motorman, and 6 policemen from the Haarlem Police Headquarters just around the corner. After lunch, the children started coming, and as children always did, they went straight to Father. The older ones sat on the floor around him, the smallest ones climbed into his lap. In addition to his twinkling eyes, Father ticked. Watches lying on the shelf run differently from watches carried about, so Father always wore the ones he was regulating. His suit jackets had inside pockets fitted with hooks for 12 watches, so whenever he went to the hum of hundreds of little wheels went with him. Now, with a child on each knee, and 10 more crowded close, he drew from another pocket his heavy cross-shaped winding key. With a flick of his finger, he made it spin, gleaming, glinting. A shriek below told me that Pickwick had arrived. We sometimes forgot, we who loved him, what a shock the first sight of him could be to a stranger. I hurried down to the door and got him upstairs. He sank his bulk into a chair beside Father, fixed one eye on me, the other on the ceiling, and said, 5 lumps, please. Pickwick loved children as much as Father did, but while children took to Father on sight, Pickwick had to win them. He had one trick that never failed. I brought him his cup of coffee thick with sugar and watched him look around in mock consternation. But, my dear Cornelia, he cried, there's no table to set it on. He glanced out of one wide-set eye to make sure the children were watching. Well, it's a lucky thing I brought my own. With that, he set cup and saucer on his own protruding paunch. I never knew a child who could resist it. Soon a respectful circle had gathered around him.